Some
Right,
people think Silicon Valley or bust, or
right.
New York City or bust. But really, being such a massive country with 350 million people and so many minor or fractured markets, so many markets besides the famous ones, if you have zero point 0.1 market share in your specific field in the United States, you're doing really well.
Welcome to the Dutch American Connection, the podcast for Dutch entrepreneurs, expats, and anyone who does business in the United States. In this podcast, I interview experts in various aspects of doing business in America, as well as Dutch entrepreneurs who work with Americans. We discuss their experiences and expertise through the lens of cultural differences. I am your host, Annette van der Velds. I'm an intercultural consultant and the founder of the Dutch American Connection. Over the years, I've helped countless expats move to the US. When I first speak to them, they're excited and ready to move to the US in the near future. However, for many, once they start the visa application process, their move is delayed, either because the visa process is a lot more complicated than anticipated, or their visas were denied. Time to explore the crucial elements of getting your US visa application approved. And who better to share his experience and insight than immigration lawyer Steve Maggi, an immigrant himself. In the years I've known Steve, he has helped countless Dutch and European clients get a US visa in the most hassle-free way possible. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell me a bit about how you got into immigration law?
Sure, Annette, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. You already know my story, but for the listeners, I'll just tell them that I am an immigrant and I'm an entrepreneur. I'm originally from Argentina. And the way that I became an immigration lawyer was really through my own personal experience. I had to go through a long immigration process because despite the fact that my mother was born in the United States, she didn't live there as an adult. And so when I was born in Argentina and my parents divorced, she could not get me a US passport. And so I had to go through a 9-year process to eventually take the oath as a US citizen at the age of 14. And so I understand what it feels like to be in this sort of gray area when it comes to the law. And that's hard enough when you have an identity crisis moving to a new continent, a new country where they speak a different language,
Right.
and then not knowing where you stand legally as well. And so I carried that sentiment and that feeling with me going forward. And after some time in journalism, I decided that I wanted to make a more personal impact on people's lives and decided to go to Georgetown Law School and study immigration law and international law, and with the goal of helping other immigrants. And then now, especially with a focus on other immigrant entrepreneurs, because that's what I am. And
Right.
so that's what I've been doing for the past 20 years.
Wow, that's quite the story. 9 years to get your US passport. And so you're from Argentina, you live in the United States. What's your connection to the Dutch community? Because you help a lot of Dutch entrepreneurs get visas to expand and scale up their business here in the United States. How did you get into focusing on the Dutch community?
Well, it all started with my mom and her love for art because she was a painter. And her favorite painters were the old masters, Dutch and Flemish. And so she used to drag me to the Metropolitan Museum, and I used to see the Bruegels and the Vermeers and all the Dutch and Flemish masters, and really got hooked on that and appreciated that. And when I moved to New York to set up the law firm, I was introduced by a Dutch woman to the consul at the time, the Dutch consul. He found out that I was a big fan of that painting, of that style of painting, and Girl with a Pearl Earring was on display at the Frick collection in Midtown. And when he found that out, he said, I want to have coffee with you. And when I met him, he actually had the book from the collection, from that specific exhibit, to
Yeah.
give to me as a gift. And that was sort of my entree into the Dutch community. And I was fortunate enough then to meet a lot of people through the Netherlands America Foundation, and then, to meet you and to meet Jacob Willemsen from Tabs and so many other people that are involved in helping the Dutch community assimilate and to prosper in the United States. Of course, as you know, the Dutch were the first in New York, and so there's this incredible bond between what was New Amsterdam and New York City
Yeah.
and the community for half a millennia now, and so I latched onto that and I started doing presentations in the Netherlands, and people, really connected with me on our shared love of art. But then also when they found out that I was from the land of Maxima,
Of
the
course.
queen, and
Yes,
that,
of course.
and we're very proud of her in Argentina because she's one of the positive examples of exports out of Argentina. And so we developed these connections, and when people saw how passionate I was about what I do and working with entrepreneurs, that's what started this relationship. And I've been really blessed to work with a lot of Dutch entrepreneurs and companies since then.
Yes, and I've heard a lot of good things about, the work you do and securing visas, even in very difficult situations. So jumping right into, securing visas, what are the most important factors when deciding to apply for a business-based visa as a Dutch person expanding to the US?
Well, I think the most important thing is doing your due diligence and your research and making sure that there is a niche that you can fill in the United States. Some
Right,
people think Silicon Valley or bust, or
right,
New York City or bust, but really, being such a massive country with 350 million people and so many minor or fractured markets, so many markets besides the famous ones, if you have zero point 0.1 market share in your specific fields in the United States, you're doing really well. Or if you are the number one company in Wisconsin, for example, you're doing really well. So it's not about conquering the entire country. It's about figuring out where you fill a need, and that can be anywhere in the United States. And you can be successful based on what your expectations are. But you want to make sure you're doing your research and you're using ESTA to come here and to meet with people and to see what its life is like on the ground
right.
before you start planning your visa procedure, because the visa will inevitably be tied to the US business that you set up. And if your US business doesn't work, then you can lose that visa status. So you need to think about visas and what kind, and strategize with an expert about that. But first, make sure that you're really sure that you will be successful in the US with your business.
Yes, and I hear that so often. And success is defined as, having a strategy, having a product, having a lot of money. It takes a lot of money, but also being able to adapt your Dutch business model to the American culture, being able to hire people, Americans on the ground here, and having them work together with the Dutch back home. That is a very important part of establishing your business here. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, you touched on so many important issues. I think there's the concept of marginality, which is important, which means that if your business only benefits you and your immediate family, and you can't convince a consular official or an immigration official in the US that it will create new jobs that otherwise wouldn't exist, there
Right,
is no incentive for them to grant you a visa. That's number one. And it doesn't have to be an extension of a Dutch business. It can be a brand new business. But the
right.
important thing is that you will show in your business plan that you have the intention of creating those jobs. And as you mentioned, the funding and the money, how much is really relative. We've done visas for an investment of 100,000 all the way to, one of our clients who's a hotel chain that invested 30 million. It depends on the size and scope of the business, but the important thing is that you have enough money to cover the operating costs that you're projecting for the
Right.
first year without any consideration of potential revenue. In other words, if you have no revenue in year one, but you still have enough funds to create those new jobs and to function as an entity, you should be able to get the visa. And that's important because a lot of Dutch entrepreneurs want to try to cut corners or minimize costs. If you
Yeah.
don't put that money in that US bank account for your US business, there's no reason for them to grant you the visa. So you need to make peace with that. You need to go, as we say in the US, all in
Yes.
proposing.
Yeah. Right, yeah, different criteria for getting a visa. So you mentioned it has to benefit the US by creating jobs here. You have to have enough money to set up shop for 1 year without creating revenue. Are there any other criteria that the US government will look at to decide if they will give you a visa or not?
Yeah, those are the two principal factors that they'll look at, whether it's an L1 visa, which means you're transferring someone from a Dutch company or from another affiliate from another country into the US entity,
Yeah.
or an E2, which is really completely Dutch based and it's only for Dutch nationals if the US company is majority Dutch owned. But
Right.
they will look at funding and they will look at potential job creation. And so I think you have to be able to take that research that you did that we talked about before to convince yourself that it's a good idea to do business in the US and put that into a really strong business plan. Because once you've met all the legal requirements, that final decision is going to be made by someone who's probably not a lawyer. They're probably an economist or they have an MBA and they
Right.
know, does this pass the sniff test or not? Meaning, does this smell like a business that's going to actually function well and create those jobs and then be self-sustaining and not require additional investment? That's where you show that your business plan and that your project is actually one that's going to function. So I think that that's the third cog in this wheel is the business model itself. You can't hide its defects when you're applying for a visa, especially the first ones. You have to show that this new venture will succeed. So it's always US based. You have to think about when I do these petitions, I'm always thinking everything I put in here is how will this benefit the US and how can I make that argument throughout this? And that also goes to showing that the person that will be transferred or the new, or perhaps the principal investor is qualified to run the business. Some Dutch nationals, they invest in franchises, for example, through the E2. They
Yeah.
set up a US company, sign a franchise agreement. But why does that work if they don't have previous experience with that franchise? Because they have the backing of the franchise, or they're pledging to put a general manager or an operations manager in the fold to help run the business to make sure that it functions. So
Right.
that's it. You have to quell all those potential fears and doubts from the beginning. And then when you go for renewals or you want to add more Dutch individuals to your company through other visas, you want to show that that plan is being implemented, that you're meeting those goals, that you're creating those jobs.
Okay. So the important thing to keep in mind is that this is for the benefit of creating American jobs. This is not for the benefit of a Dutch individual.
Yes, and it's funny because one of the presentations I did in Amsterdam probably 8 or 9 years ago, an individual came up to me after and he said, Steve, I have the best business model. It will allow me to work from home on the beach in Miami, where I would love to live,
Yeah.
and sit in my pajamas and make lots of money. And I said to him, that is amazing. I'm really happy for you. The problem is there's no way I can get you a visa with this business model because no one else is benefiting but you. It doesn't pass the marginality test. You have to show that you will create jobs, which leads me to this other part that we've discussed in the past is you have to have a physical space. So he talked about working from his home.
Yeah.
That will not work when you present a visa. If you show an address and the outside looks like a house or the inside doesn't have its own office space that has enough space for those additional employees,
Right.
they will sniff that out and it will look like you're not going all in, which is the kind of the vibe that you have to communicate throughout the petition is you're so serious and you're not going to cut corners and you're going to get that what's called sufficient physical premises, which is an actual office. So even if your business is virtual and your
Yeah.
employees are around the country, you need a headquarters somewhere. You get an office with tabs in New York, or you look for a cheap office space in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or whatever it is, but you have to have an actual physical space where you're going to be headquartered, whether people will actually spend all their time working there or not. If you don't and you cut those corners,
Yeah.
then you make all this investment to save a few dollars in the short run, you end up not getting your visa. And so I don't present those cases. And my clients will tell you, if you ask them, they'll say, Steve is a stickler for these details. He does not submit petitions unless they're 100% compliant. That's the only way that I can maximize the chances for my clients. And that's the only way I can look at myself in the mirror. If they tell me we're not going to create jobs, we just want this 3-year visa so we can make money, I will not take their case.
Right, because there's a very large chance that it will get rejected.
Or they won't be able to go for a renewal because they won't have complied or met those projections that they put in their business plan. And that means that they're not submitting the case in good faith. And I can't be a party to a case where my client doesn't actually have that intention. One of the beautiful things about being an immigrant and an entrepreneur is when you create jobs for other people because you're
Right.
contributing to the economy as well. That's what I want my clients to do.
So, why do you need a visa anyway? Why can't people? I mean, America is the land of immigrants and freedom. Why do you need a visa and a
Well,
visa for a Dutch entrepreneur?
if you look at what it says at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, it talks about give us your huddled masses yearning to be free. That is completely, unfortunately, outdated and no longer applies. My mom's parents came through Ellis Island in the 1930s,
Yeah.
fleeing Hungary and what was coming in Europe at the time. So that was true at one time, but it's no longer true. In fact, it's more difficult now to get to the U.S. legally, probably, than it is illegally. That's what one of my Dutch clients said that out of frustration when we got pushback on a visa petition, and
Yeah.
he saw it on the news that people were sneaking through the border. And I think that unfortunately we've reached that tipping point where that is actually true. So you have to be more prepared than ever now to get your visa. And then to renew it, you really have to be able to come through and comply and meet those projections that you are putting into your visa applications. It's the tide has turned completely. The Dutch do have the advantage of being one of the 39 visa waiver countries. So going back to your question, that does allow people to enter the United States as long as they apply for ESTA, are approved, and then they keep it active because a lot of people let it lapse during the beginning of the COVID
Can you just
pandemic.
explain what
Forgot.
ESTA means and explain a bit more visa waiver and ESTA? Can you explain
I
that?
mean, ESTA is just the electronic system for travel authorization. And if you're a national of one of these 39 countries that's on the list, which includes the Netherlands,
Yeah.
you don't have to go to the US consulate in Amsterdam and apply for a visa to enter the US, either for tourism or what's really appropriate here that applies to our conversation is what's called business visitor purposes. So you get all the rights and privileges of a visa holder, what's called a B1, B2 visa, but you don't actually have to apply for it. And that's a huge advantage that Dutch nationals have that people from 165 countries or so don't have. That
So
does not mean, though, just to finish my thought, that does not mean that you can abuse that by doing things that are not authorized under ESTA or under the tourist or B1, B2 visa, which is working for a US entity without a work visa. That's why you need a visa to work in the US if you're representing or working for any US company.
yeah.
That's when you need a work visa or authorization from the US government to work.
But going back to my question, why has the government put in place these visa requirements? Why can't you just come here and work?
Well, because then it would be the Wild West and there would be, 1.5 billion people living in the United States. I saw a poll at one point, a global poll. I don't know how many people they polled, but something like 20% of people said that if they had an opportunity to live in the US, that they would. So
There,
you take 1/5 of 8 billion people, and you're, 1.5, 1.6, 1.67 billion people, whatever the number would be, that would want to live in the US on top of the people that are already here. There is opportunity here, but they make it difficult because they're also, as you know, and maybe it's not the same way in the Netherlands, but politicians in the US are always covering themselves and they're trying to get voted back in so they can be career politicians, which means they have to show their local constituents that they're supposedly protecting their jobs, because there's this misnomer that jobs are being taken by immigrants when we know that the low-level jobs, that Americans don't want them, and so immigrants are needed. And then there's a shortage of high-level, STEM related field individuals and really highly qualified people in professional positions in the US. We need more of those. But the politicians push back and they require all these visas because they want to look like they're protecting Americans from this invasion of people who might take their jobs. And this is a podcast, so you can't see my quotes in the air when I say invasion, but this is the mentality that they have.
Yeah.
They're not thinking about long-term positive results that come from enhanced immigration, especially high-level immigration. They're
Right.
only thinking about today and next election, and how do I make sure that the people continue to vote for me? That's where everything is completely skewed with immigration.
Moving away from the political side, but thank you for answering this so frankly. You've already mentioned there are L1 visas, E visas. What's the difference? What's the difference between these visas and type of visa, cost,
Right.
limitations, criteria? Can you talk a bit about that? And can you also
Yeah.
mention this family? Like, are you allowed to bring your family on both visas, and can your spouse work?
Okay, so I'll jump on that question first. The good news is E and L have the same treatment now, and spouses and actually children can work. When you enter the US now with either one of those visas, you have to make sure, and I've seen this happen many times with my Dutch clients in the past year, as of January 14th of 2022, they allow spouses and children to be eligible to work, but they have to make an annotation on their I-94, which is their record of entry. So
Right.
if it says E2 for the spouse, there needs to be an S after that. The reason why I say children too is because we actually have an E2 that we got through the consulate a few months ago, where the 7-year-old son is being sought after by a lot of talent agents because he's super attractive and talented and all that, and they want to start getting him for photo shoots and do videos and then making money for the parents. So he's going to be 7. And because as long as he has the authority from his parents still in California to work, he's given permission to work by them, he can
Right.
actually use this E2S status to work. So the great news is that E2 and L1 spouses and children are actually eligible to work. But you have to make sure that that's in the record. So when you get to the port of entry, you ask that CBP officer, please make sure that you put the notation of S on my record. Otherwise, they can't, because before you had to go through this long process to get an employment authorization document, which could
I
take 6.
remember. Yeah.
Yes. And that's a nightmare, especially with the bureaucracy and the backlogs. And then you get a job offer, but you can't start working. Now, if you get that annotation, you can work immediately as soon as you enter the US. So it's a huge advantage. So that's just tackling that question first. In terms of E2 versus L1, number one, E2 does not require a foreign entity. So we talked about people who maybe set up a new US company and get a franchise and run a laundromat or an ice cream shop or something very that has the backing of a franchise, does
Yeah.
not require a foreign entity. So the E2s are simpler in that way. L1s are contemplated for multinational companies. They
Can I
expect a
just stop you? When you say foreign entity, do you mean a Dutch entity in our case here?
Right. So in your case, I think you had come in on an L1, you told me a long time ago. So for an L1, that requires a legal relationship between a US company, which is always the one that sponsors you, and
Right.
then a foreign entity, and you have to have worked in a managerial or executive capacity or have what's called specialized knowledge for at least 1 year out of the last 3 for that foreign entity.
Right.
On top of that, that you have to show that you're part of a corporate hierarchy, which means there's multi-levels, there's managerial level, executive, there's subordinate employees, there's a huge infrastructure. That means we're talking about companies with €1 million and above probably in revenue. Whereas E2 is for startups. It's called the startup visa or the entrepreneurial visa because it doesn't require a foreign entity.
Right.
And you can do a brand new concept or model, a consulting business, a franchise, or whatever you want in the US without ever having a related entity. So there's more flexibility. There's more flexibility in this process.
So you don't have to have a US company sponsoring you if there doesn't have to be a company in the US yet.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I missed the entity question. You cannot have a visa in the US, a work visa at all, unless you are sponsored by a US company. The beauty of E2 is you can set up your own company. In other words, you hire someone in the US, an accountant or an incorporation service or a corporate lawyer is probably the best option to incorporate a company for you. And you have to show for E2 purposes that you or if you have a foreign entity, are the main owners, at least 50% of that US company. If you do that, that entity qualifies as a sponsor for your visa. The same for an L1. Usually it's a subsidiary of the foreign company that's set up, which means a Dutch BV is 100% owner of the US Inc. or LLC. That is always a requirement. But the beauty of E2 is that you're essentially self-sponsoring through the US company that you set up.
And so, are there any costs associated with the visa and the
Yes,
application?
and
And
so those costs, and I want to go to the practical part of this first,
yeah,
and then I'll talk about it, because the costs are almost the same now. It's a little bit more expensive for an L because you have more fees and you have to do what's called premium processing to get a response quickly,
yeah.
which is almost an extortive level of costs. But
How
now there's
much?
something called, well, it's, you're looking at over 4,000, you're looking at almost 4,000 in filing fees. The 2,500 is what's charged for premium processing. So you get a response in 15 days versus in 7 or 8 months. And you need to get that answer because you need to use the full length of that visa. And if it's an L1, so
Yeah,
going to practicality, if it's a new company, an L1 new office visa is 1 year only. And
right,
that means you have to then show that you've created jobs and created a corporate hierarchy in 1 year. It's almost impossible to do with a new operation.
right.
E2 is a 3-year visa now. So the costs are a little bit less. You have something called reciprocity, which now is $2,228. And that's a really strange number, but it matches what the Dutch government charges American citizens to work in the Netherlands. So the costs are pretty much the same, but you get 3 years instead of one. It used to be 5. And on top of that, the acceptance or the approval levels are much higher for E2 because there's the reason why the consular division exists.
Yeah,
Yeah, and just to explain sort of the immigration politics here, each embassy also has an attaché from Department of Commerce. Their job is to create and generate more business flow between the two countries.
right,
So the politics behind an E2 at the consulate in Amsterdam, which is directly applied for, is to approve cases where they think that it's going to generate jobs and create more revenue in the US. Whereas USCIS, Immigration Service in the US, which is what adjudicates the L1s, they have a mandate to try to deny cases because of this political part I talked about, the appearing to be tough on immigration. So we're talking about very low percentage of denials in the consulate on E2s and a quite high level, probably over 30% from Immigration Service on L1s. So all things being equal, the E2 is always the better option
yeah,
if, and here's the caveat, if it's a Dutch national that you're sponsoring. So if the US company is at least 50% Dutch owned,
yeah,
and they look at what's called UBOs, ultimate beneficial owners of, let's say there's a Dutch entity and there's lots of BVs in between, which happens a lot, as you know, with Dutch businesses, a lot of holdings and different different structures and different owners. They
yeah.
look at who the final owners are, who really owns the US company way back when. 50% are Dutch or more. Any Dutch national can qualify for an E2 with the US company. If you have employees, as the Netherlands does, it's becoming more and more international, has more people working there from other countries,
Yeah.
EU countries. Those people would only have the option of an L1 because they're not Dutch.
Oh, wow. So your employee has to have a Dutch passport, Dutch citizenship to qualify for the E2.
So we have many companies where we're doing, we had one hotel company that I mentioned that I won't name, but they set up a few hotels in New York. And
Yeah.
we ended up doing 3 different kinds of visas for them because one guy was Dutch, E2, another guy was L1. He was based, I think, in Indonesia. And then we had a person that really was at a higher level and was well known in their position. So we did what's called an O1 for them because that was a better fit for them. So depending on the nationality of the individuals to be sponsored, that also shapes your decision about which visa you use. And sometimes you do 2 or 3 different kinds for the same company.
Wow. It's a lot more complicated than what you think of at the start, right?
It is, and if I always say if it was easy, I wouldn't have a job. But that's what makes it so fascinating for me is I have to be sort of the person that creates the strategy
Yeah.
based on this and come up with this puzzle and try to put it together. And there's a lot of moving parts, but that's what makes it so dynamic and fun and challenging for me, and that's why I love to do it.
And listeners, we're recording this on Zoom, so I can see Steve, and yeah, he is so enthusiastic when he talks about immigration law. It's very energizing. I wish you could see it. So, Steve, anything else? Like, or let me ask you, what is the biggest question, or what is the question you get most often asked by Dutch people who want to set up a company in the US, who want to move here?
I think I don't want to overgeneralize too much. There are exceptions. With the majority of my Dutch clients, I think it's a question of mentality, meaning you have to put on the hat and the mentality of a US official, and you have to understand that if you don't play by the rules, you're not going to get this approved. So they like to tell stories about that other people have told them about how they invested less than they were supposed to. They didn't get a physical office space, but the official allowed them to have the visa anyway. It's almost as if they were proud to have cut corners and still have gotten the final result. Those are the people that cut the corners and didn't get their visas are not telling anybody about it. And
No.
there's a lot more of those that are not doing everything they can and not going all in. And so that's the majority of the questions I get are, can I do this without a physical office space? Can I not invest X amount, even though that's how much we're projecting to need to spend? Can I not create this second job, or can I do it part-time, or can I do it in quarter 4 of the first year?
Yeah.
Always questions about how to minimize. The best thing to do is to project a complete petition with real commitment, creating those jobs, putting your money where your mouth is, as they say, by putting that money up. And until you get your visa, you don't move those funds. Because I've had cases where people took the money and then applied, and then, it can take 4, 5, 6 months to get an appointment. And that money is sent back to the Netherlands. And then when the consulate says, give us updated bank statements, how do you explain the fact that that money is no longer there? They're going to discount that from the investment amount. Then you have to go into an extra level of explaining,
Yeah.
which makes my life much more difficult. So my favorite clients are the ones that say, Steve, we're in your hands. We have the funding for this. We're committed. We're going to do as you ask because you've done hundreds and hundreds of these petitions. We want to get these visas, and we have these positive goals. So that's the thing, is don't cut corners, especially because you cannot hide when you're submitting a comprehensive petition,
Yeah.
and not hide anything. And if they sniff anything being off, like having a home office or the funds not being there or funds disappearing in the
Right.
process,
Yeah.
that minimizes your chances of getting an approval. And what's the point of doing this if you're not going to do it 100%?
Yeah, you mentioned you've got to think like an American immigration officer, and that's with everything doing business as a foreigner doing business in the United States. It's so important to think like an American, to understand how Americans think. And that's part of the solutions I provide, is to help Dutch people understand how Americans think, to get into that American mind. And once you understand how they think and why they think and what the reasons and the backgrounds are, then you can adjust your strategy to it.
Yeah, and I think I know you help Dutch companies that are setting up in other countries too. I think that's a universal truth.
Yeah.
I think the way of doing business in the US is very unique. It's always changing. People are a lot more sensitive than they used to be. You can't act in the workplace like you did even 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And that sensitivity training in big companies is now a requirement, even for Americans. Can you imagine if you come in as a new company and bringing in your mentality from somewhere else?
Yeah.
That could backfire. That could end up in lawsuits and who knows what. And then all of a sudden you're back in Rotterdam a year later, and you're starting all over again. That's not the point, right? So that's part of what I was saying in the beginning about doing your research, but also to maintain your status and potentially sponsor other people for visas and be successful business. That cultural aspect is immensely important.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. Um, so, Steve, one last question I want to ask you: the green card lottery. I know a lot of people who have won a green card, a lot of Dutch people, and a lot of Swedish people who have won a green card. And so, for my listeners, the green card lottery, it's called the diversity lottery, and it's a lottery where Certain nationals can enter the lottery, and when they win a chance to apply for a green card. And a green card is a residence permit. Now, this is only for certain nationalities. It's only for those nationalities where there is not a lot of immigration. So in the United States, there's a lot of immigration from India, from China. So those countries are excluded from the lottery, but there's not a lot of immigration from the Netherlands, for example. So those countries can participate in the diversity lottery, also known as the green card lottery. Do you have any tips for entering the green card lottery and increasing your chances of winning?
Well, my tip would be that there's no harm done, meaning there's nothing that can, no outcome can affect any potential plans to get a green card or even a work visa or anything else. You can have a work visa currently, you can have a green card process in process. Like, for example, if you have a brother or sister that's a US citizen, you have a 12-year wait to get a green card because of the backlogs. But in the meantime, you can still apply for the diversity lottery. So I'm not going to get into the politics of the lottery. I think it's interesting and that it's so hard for people who are actually qualified to get visas. And then there are some people that get it mostly because of where they're from and the lack of a representation.
Right.
But if you're Dutch, you have to take advantage of the fact that you're from a country that's not as populated as a lot of the other ones that you mentioned or other big countries. And if you're really interested in living in the US, you keep applying every year. It's really not a complicated process. One thing you should watch out for is something, there are a lot of scam websites, meaning if you get an email or you find a website that says, give us $100 to start your process, the process is free. So any website that asks you to pay, you're never going to have anything submitted. They're just going to keep your money. So just be careful that you're working only with government websites. I, as a grammar hound, can tell within 10 seconds because the grammar is always bad on those sites. There's always mistakes.
Yes.
If it's not an official government site, don't use it. If you want that possibility out there, you should just keep applying every year. No harm, no foul.
Exactly. That's great advice. And government websites you can recognize by the extension .gov, G-O-V. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Steve. If people want to get in touch with you, I will put the link to your LinkedIn profile and to your website on the show notes. But can you tell me, what is the easiest way for someone to get in touch with you?
I think email is the easiest. My email is smaggi@smalawyers.com.
Okay, I'll put that information on the show notes page. Thank you so much for your time. This has been very valuable, very clarifying.
Thank you, Annette. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes at DutchAmericanConnection.com/podcast/12. And be sure to check out my website, DutchAmericanConnection.com, for more valuable resources, including a guide on the top 10 tips for doing business in the US. On this website, you can also sign up for my newsletter so you never miss another episode of this podcast. The next podcast will be released in early April. In this podcast, Sophie Bouteligier of Expandify and I will have a conversation about the best way to select a US partner. Stay tuned!